Welcome to the Anything Gender podcast. I am your host, Sharmin Prince, and today we have Rachel Cottam. And Rachel is a gender allyship speaker and writer who believes we need men and women working together to create gender equity. Rachel created the Allies at Work playbook to share easy tactics to level the playing field. And you can download that at rachelcottam.com. Rachel is currently collaborating with the Utah Women and Leadership Project to close the gender pay gap in her state. She shares her story on LinkedIn and she loves her husband and 3 feminists. Welcome, Rachel. When I read your bio and I saw that you're raising 3 feminists, I mean that puts a smile on my face and it warms my heart. So welcome to the Anything Gender podcast.
Thank you, Sharmin. I'm happy to be here. And yes, I love being a mom to 3 feminists. I've got 1 boy, 2 girls. They all keep me on my toes and they all help me learn how to be a little bit more inclusive. So I love being a mom. It's a blast.
So thank you. Is there anything that you would like to add that was missing or wasn't included in your bio?
I think you covered it. I mean, for me, it's really been an interesting journey in my career. I started as a high school English teacher because I felt like I had to choose a mom job, and switching into tech was somewhat accidental. It was a job I took just to help us make ends meet. I thought I'd be gone within a few months, and very quickly I saw an opportunity to improve the quality of life for my family, as well as really push myself to get more engaged in this space where I was the only woman in the office. So it's been a journey for me. I'm excited to talk through it a little bit today.
Now, when I read male allyship, it's interesting, it's intriguing, it's exciting, uh, and I would like you to define it for our listeners.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity. I know when I've shared male allyship before, I once had somebody ask, so are you advocating for men? Like, are you trying to get men to have more power and influence? And I had to correct him and say, no, it's really about men being better allies for women. So it's this opportunity for men who are already in positions of power, who have a lot of influence in their communities and their workplaces, to get curious about the dynamics around them and to use that opportunity to kind of reject this zero-sum mentality, this scarcity mindset that sometimes exists in corporate America, and instead reach across and to be an ally for women and other underrepresented groups in their organizations.
Thank you. Thank you for defining that. And what was your inspiration?
So as I mentioned earlier, I chose a teaching career early on because I grew up in a somewhat traditional family structure and a pretty conservative religion that told me that my job was to be a mom first, that any career ambitions I had were going to be secondary to my husband's, secondary to any primary caregiving responsibilities I had in the home. And that kind of turning point I mentioned earlier happened because of financial reasons, but it really unlocked this whole new level of Rachel that I didn't know exist previously. And I realized there was this opportunity to be a leader, to make an impact, and also to build bridges, to create allies instead of enemies. In that first job, yes, I was the only woman in an office. We were a small startup, so we were only 8 people. But I had really incredible mentors in that space who, once that company got acquired and we're all of a sudden in a much bigger organization, they advocated for me to get a 52% pay raise because I was out of pay parity with my male counterparts. They also helped me to get opportunities in hiring, to be a manager to interns, to have these really pivotal leadership opportunities that I was just like this entry-level copywriter I wouldn't have had without their voice speaking my name in the rooms where I wasn't. So I was really fortunate to be kind of pushed forward on this leadership path because of the male allies who spoke up for me. I also, as we all have, then experienced what it might look like to be on a more negative end of things, where there's not enough men speaking the names of women in the rooms where we're not, where men are kind of stuck in their traditional understanding of what roles should look like in the workplace. And so made some not necessarily poor intentioned comments, but where the impact was really damaging to the women, the mothers, primary caregivers, and other groups in those corporate spaces. So I've really seen both sides, as we all have, and I think it's worth celebrating the opportunities that we have to create more of those positive experiences versus really criticizing all the bad that happened. Like, let's celebrate ways that we can build gender equity together. And so that's kind of what got me interested in male allyship.
I love that. I love
Thank you.
And oftentimes when I don't want to say women um, get opportunities that promotes them, they keep it to themselves.
Mm,
Um, but you didn't do that. Why?
that's a great question. I think honestly, I probably popped out of the womb with a little too much gumption, a little too much confidence. So I honestly think there was a little bit of that, just my nature, that hey, let's speak up about these opportunities. Let's reach out to each other and create space for each other. Um, but I think we've also seen women in society who are rewarded for their good girl behavior. And, growing up for me, it was so much about get the A's, do everything perfect. There's a lot of appearance bias for women in the workplace that we have to look or dress a certain way, that everything has to be just so. And so I think oftentimes as women, we're afraid to toot our own horn. We're afraid to celebrate our own achievements because we've been told that if we just work hard, somebody's going to come give us the gold star. Somebody's going to come give us the A grade. I've heard this tendency described as tiara syndrome. Have you heard of this before?
No.
It was really revolutionary to me the first time I heard of it, because it's essentially this idea that women work hard and we keep our heads down and we expect someone to come and place a tiara on our head and say, "Oh, you earned the promotion, you earned the raise, like it's you did a good job." And this just really wasn't how it worked for me in the corporate environment. And I don't think it's an experience that many women have. So we kind of have to push through this tiara syndrome and we have to learn to advocate for ourselves. For me, that looks like developing my own weekly report that I emailed to my boss at the end of every week saying, "Hey, here's all the stuff that I got done this week. You didn't even have to think about it because I was getting it done." This has also looked like making sure that I attribute all of the work that I do. And this, again, is kind of like a corporate application, but make sure that the work that I do, I've got numbers tied to it. So whether that's revenue that I'm earning for the company, whether that's time savings, whether that's efficiencies gained, I have to make sure that I speak up and I own my own impact, because I've learned that other folks aren't necessarily going to do that for me. Now, is that why I love male allyship? Because then it creates a really easy entry point for men to speak up and amplify women's voices and speak their names in the rooms where they're not present. Yes, I love that. But I think as women too, we can kind of push through some of that socialization and learn to speak up for ourselves a bit more. Has that been your experience too, Sharmin?
I have worked in the nonprofit sector, so predominantly women.
Mm.
So I have never been able to enjoy the experience that you've had, right? Because the nonprofit doesn't, you may have a few men, maybe 3 or 5 to 5% men in the executive positions, but it's predominantly women.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
what do you do to kind of advocate for yourself? What are the ways that you're able to kind of speak up and make sure that you're owning your own recognition?
I'm very authentic.
Yeah.
And so I have had to learn how to advocate for myself in that space
Mm,
um, because of microaggressions, because despite it's all women, the dynamics, I think, are harder and more difficult. So the should I don't know. I don't know if I can compare it because I've never been in the environment with men. So
Interesting.
I can't make a comparison, but I've had to advocate for myself. I've had to fight. Sometimes I was pushed into a corner.
Mm,
Um, I've had to deal with a lot, and thus I left my career
mm.
and started my own nonprofit. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, forgive me if I put you on the spot, but I couldn't miss an opportunity. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. How was your understanding of feminism and maybe gender equity or other gender issues evolve over time?
Mm. I love that question, and I would be silly to say that it's not still evolving. Um, as I mentioned, I live in the state that ranks worst for gender equality in the US. I grew up in California, and as I mentioned, while there was pretty traditional family roles, like I also saw my mom as an incredibly strong woman. Like I never felt limited by what I could achieve. Um, I just felt like once I chose to get married, there was kind of a cap, or there was kind of a division of labor that just wasn't naturally expected of me. And I've seen similar things in Utah, and it's represented by the data. By all accounts, we rank worst for gender equality in the U.S. Um, when you look at the gender pay gap, we're always somewhere in the bottom three. The U.S. is around about 82 cents on the dollar is what women make. In Utah, it's closer to 71 or 72 cents. So there's definitely been an evolution for me moving to this state, living here, working most of my jobs in the state of Utah, and observing that dynamic in play, that it feels like things are about 30 to 50 years behind maybe the national standard. But as I've spoken up on LinkedIn, as I've started volunteering in my community and just kind of sharing my story online, I've found that this isn't an isolated corner of the US, and it's not even an isolated corner of the world. There's a lot of spaces that look like mine, where there's a lot of work to do to just bring awareness to male allies, for example, that there might be some of those dynamics at play. Some of the things that you even mentioned around the microaggressions, sometimes folks are just ignorant to that. They just don't see it. And so I think kind of the first step in my journey of feminism has been, how can we draw awareness in a way that doesn't immediately put folks on the defensive? That doesn't immediately make folks feel like, wait, I didn't do this, not me, right? But it helps them just to kind of get curious about the dynamics at play. I think too, the first book I read on the topic was Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. And I just last week was reading an article about her somewhat complicated, controversial legacy. And I'm grateful that in more recent years, I've picked up books like Hood Feminism, like White Women by Regina. Oh, I always mix up their last names, Regina Jackson and Saira Rao. That one I would highly recommend to anyone who looks like me and is trying to kind of push through some of the biases that we're not aware of. But for me, I've learned that feminism has to be intersectional. It has to advocate not only for women, but for folks who might not be on the gender binary. Feminism has to look at folks who are people of color, people who might have a disability, neurodivergence, like feminism that is not inclusive of women as they are, which is as individuals, I feel like is a big miss. So again, I'm learning in public here. I'm open to correction. I would love to hear maybe how you define feminism and how folks like me can continue on that evolution. But I'm really grateful for people who have been patient and kind correctors when I've gotten it wrong.
Wow, wow. That it's so great to hear you say that.
Thank you.
And for women who are listening and they are afraid to even embrace the term being a feminist because
Mhm.
um of the the negative connotation that was attached to that, what would you say to those women? And they really want to be advocates.
Yes, I would say go pick up it's a like a 80-page book called We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I first heard her speak. She has a TED Talk on the topic and essentially said, we should all be feminists the same way that we should all be humanists. We all care about equal opportunity and equal respect. And so feminism is not exclusively like women should have more, men should have less. It's not this zero-sum game. It's that we should all be supportive and inclusive of each other. So that book changed my life. I've read it probably 3 times. So highly recommend that as an entry point to women who are trying to figure out where to start. And I recently did a poll actually on my LinkedIn asking if men can be feminist. And I saw some really interesting results. About 87% of folks, both men and women, said, yeah, of course men can be feminists. They should be feminists. Like it's not an exclusive club. Everyone should be a feminist. But when I broke it down by gender, what I saw was only about 75% of men believes that men could be feminists, while 91% of women did. So we know where the impact is there. Yes, 91%, that should be 100% of women who believe that we can support each other and that it's not that zero-sum game. But I think we see that there's a greater impact available when men and women are working together for gender equality versus when we feel like feminism is actually putting us in an us versus them mentality.
Thank you for that. And what did that data of the 71% of men say to you about allyship?
It said to me that awareness piece is critical, right? That we just have to help men understand feminism actually helps you too. I think again, when we frame feminism as only helping women, only being a benefit of women, then it is harder to convince male allies to jump on the bandwagon. But when we remind folks that feminism actually empowers men to live into their full selves, then we see the true power of men and women working together. Then we say that, we can let women be smart, but we can also let men be pretty. We can empower women to be more assertive, maybe even more aggressive at times. And we can also help men to be really contrite listeners. We can help them to really believe the voices of the women and other underestimated groups around them. We can let women like me be the sole breadwinners for our home. And my husband, who for the last 3 years, basically since I switched to more of this full-time leadership role, has been the primary caregiver in our home. He's the stay-at-home dad. And I think that's probably the best thing we're doing for our kids in teaching them about gender equity, is just modeling that those more traditional roles, those more stereotypically father, mother, masculine, feminine, whatever you want to call it, that we don't have to put people in boxes, that we don't have to stay in those boxes, but that we can all lean into our individual personalities. And in those partnerships, whether it's at home or in the workplace, we can lift each other. Anyways, I think that maybe I got off topic there, but that's
No,
really what.
you didn't. No, you didn't. Listen, I appreciate you sharing adding your personal story, and I think it's inspiring.
Thank you.
Because I really think that the gender, if we are going to say that we're desirous of gender equity or gender equality, we should be comfortable in switching the roles. So
Yeah. Thank you, Sharmin.
I offer you your flowers. I really like that. On that note, what are some of the misconceptions about male allies
Mm.
that you may have encountered?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is how hard it is to get started. I think a lot of times um, men believe that in order to kind of assume this role of allyship, that it means they have to be doing all the things. They have to be going to the women's employee research group. They have to be taking on more of the responsibilities at home, like my husband. They think, oh, do I have to be a stay-at-home dad? Like they they might feel this barrier to entry into be a male ally. And to me, the biggest misconception is that male allyship is not it doesn't have to be this massive change, this overnight change. It's something that you can implement every day. So these are kind of like the tactics that I love talking about. For example, one is this idea of parenting out loud. Women in the workplace still experience this motherhood penalty where after having children, women typically receive about a 6% decrease of compensation over a lifetime. So you look at the graph and a man with children versus a woman with children, there's going to be a gap pretty much from the time she has that child until the end of her life in her pay. The same thing applies to a woman without children or a woman with children. So one thing that men can do to counteract this kind of pressure and this stereotype is if they're in a leadership position, they can start talking about their parenting responsibilities. They can say, oh, I'm actually leaving work early today to go to my daughter's dance recital. Or if they've got a sick kid at home, they can work from home. If the kid pops up on Zoom, they can make it totally normalized and remove some of this pressure that women feel to, like work like you don't have kids. And then, that's just not the reality. So that's kind of just like an example of a micro action. Happy to share more of those. That's what I love talking about is these tiny steps that men can take to enter the field of allyship. To your question, it's a misconception that you have to do it all right away. The best thing for male allies to do is just start doing small things like parenting out loud or listening to a woman's story or even picking up one of those books I mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm sure that even not just the women, but the men that are listening to us uh, would become allies after listening to you
Thank
because you're that convincing. You're very inspirational and motivating. So thank you.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
yes. I love to give people their flowers. Tomorrow's not promised. I may not get the chance to do that to you, to give you your flowers another time, so why not? Um, have you ever encountered or received backlash from other men
Mm.
while um
Yeah, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, I I try to focus on the positive and maybe not dwell on those moments of backlash, but I think we've all experienced times where our level of leadership, for example, might not be valued in the same way. When we come across as kind and caring, um, there's this idea called the likability trap, where if we're women, we can be likable, but if we're likable, we won't be viewed as competent, and vice versa, right? Like you can either be liked or you can be good at your job, but it's really hard to do both. And so I think that might be one example where I've had to really find a balance in my leadership style, where I can still be clear and considerate, um, while also, you know, being firm about about what we're moving forward on. I think too, probably one of the questions that I've faced more often is around my role as primary caregiver. Um, excuse me, my role as primary breadwinner. um, I think oftentimes men who encounter that worry then wonder about like the competence of my husband. And they say, oh, well, could he not hold a job? Like, why would he make that choice? Isn't he so bored at home? And I think one of the things that I've been able then to share or maybe educate them on is, well, this is what's working for our family. And my husband is great with the kids. And yes, there was a learning curve for him too, just like there was for me. I didn't, come out of the womb knowing how to change a diaper or make dinner. Those are skills that you learn as a parent or as a caregiver. And so I think that might be another example of some of that backlash is just the opportunity to share, this is my role in my family. And so my compensation is just as important as that man who is the sole breadwinner for his family. My ambitions are not less because I'm a mother. In fact, they might be more. Who's more productive than a mom with a 5:30 pickup? Like I think just helping to um, help the men around me understand what my reality looks like helps them then to maybe be more curious about what the reality of other men or women around them might look like.
wow, wow, thank you. Let's
Mhm.
talk a little about workplace dynamics. Um, how can men in leadership position foster like a more inclusive work environment since
Mm.
we have so many men in leadership?
I love that question. I might turn it back on you after I answer because I think it looks different in every organization. So I'm curious what you might share. But um, for me, I've really seen that parenting out loud technique to be a really powerful um, tool for at least gender inclusion in the workplace. I think it's meaningful too, because even those folks, male or female, who might have other priorities outside of work, who might be hosting an art show or who might be caring for an elderly parent, if they see a male leader who is willing to prioritize and vocalize their family responsibilities, then they know that they have the permission to do the same and they don't feel like, oh, if I, have to leave work early for a doctor's appointment or to babysit my niece or to go to a friend's art show, they don't feel like they're going to be penalized for that because they're seeing their male leaders do the same thing. Um, I think another thing that male leaders can do to be more inclusive is to make sure that they are amplifying the voices of those who may not have the mic as often. I heard this story about the Obama administration. While he had the most diverse cabinet in presidential history up to that point, the women and junior aides were still finding themselves spoken over in those rooms. And so these women kind of banded together and they started using this cool tool called amplification, where they would, after someone had made their comment, repeat the idea and restate the woman's name, restate the speaker's name. And this is really important. It's such a small tactic, but I think it's really meaningful because women are still, the data I saw this year from McKinsey, women are still 2 times more likely to be interrupted than men when speaking up in those workplace situations. And when they are interrupted, oftentimes the man may get credit for the woman's idea, and it kind of continues this cycle of stereotype that women may not be as competent or may not be speaking up for themselves as much. So when women adopted this tool of amplification by restating the woman's name and her idea, it helped to make sure she received the credit and also really celebrated some of those underestimated voices in the workplace. So those are just 2 tools for inclusion. I'm curious, Sharmin, what you've seen from male leaders in your organization or in your community that have helped to foster that inclusivity, whether in gender or otherwise.
Well, as I said earlier, I have not been in a work environment where there were a lot of males, but um, one of the things that I believe that is important for an inclusive work environment is for men to listen to women,
Yeah.
um, to listen, to hear their needs, um, also to understand that gender stereotypes needs to be addressed in the workplace. Uh, like when they're meeting board meetings, instead of calling the female employee to make the coffee, ask one of the male employees to make the coffee and to prepare the room. To understand that, I think you mentioned it, if a woman needs to leave early, just understanding the needs of women and um, giving them room to speak and amplify their voices, and also to really examine the deep structure of the organization, because
Mm.
within that we have all the gender biases and the norms that perpetuate discrimination.
Yeah, I love that. So well said. I read a study about that idea around the non-promotable tasks. So things like writing notes or preparing the coffee, that women are still more likely to be assigned to those tasks. And then when we take them on, trying to be the good girl, trying to be helpful, we just perpetuate this cycle of thinking, oh, again, she takes the notes. She's not the strategic thinker. And so I love that example you shared. If we can ask men to be allies in small ways, to take on some of the non-promotable tasks, then that frees up that mental space, that emotional bandwidth for women to really step in and lead. I love that example.
Thank you. Um, can you talk about the importance of, the word that everyone used today, the intersectionality in the
Mm,
context of male allyship.
mm. Yes. As I mentioned, it's something I'm still learning. So I think for me, what I've learned is so many of these tactics that I've shared that help men to be better allies for women automatically extend to some of those other underrepresented groups. So the idea of amplifying women's voices in meetings, well, say you have somebody who's shy or somebody who's neurodivergent and who may not be as comfortable speaking up in meetings, but after the meetings, they always come to you with great ideas. Well, maybe what you can do as a male ally is work with that individual, coach them beforehand, and say, I'd like to call on you in this meeting because I know you have good ideas on this project. Will you prepare something so that when I do call on you, we're able to celebrate your voice and it doesn't feel like you're being put on the spot? Um, I think, like I mentioned, the same thing applies with like that parenting out loud technique. When we advocate for parents, we also hold space for individuals, whatever their life circumstances might be, to show up authentically as themselves. Jodi Ann Burry has a TED Talk. She's the one who co-wrote that piece about stop telling women that they have imposter syndrome. This went viral a few years ago. It was in the Harvard Business Review. And in her TED Talk, she says that we can't ask unprotected groups to assume the risk of being authentic when we haven't made it safe for them to do so. So when I think about intersectionality, I think about providing that protection and safety for so many of these unprotected groups. And we have to do that by modeling authentic leadership. We have to do that by amplifying other voices, lifting as we rise, being mentors, having transparent salary conversations. We have to model that from the top, whether it's a male ally or a white woman like me. That's the only way that we'll achieve that intersectionality, if we create that safety for other folks to bring themselves to work. But we can't ask them to do that first, as long as the space that we've created is not protected for them.
Wow, wow. Thank you. Thank you. To continue in that same vein, how can men use their privilege to advocate for policy change that
Mm.
support gender equality?
Mm. I know that privilege can be a heated term for some, and often for those of us who have it. But there is a tool that I like to use when I'm teaching workshops called the Wheel of Privilege. And if you're listening now, you can just go Google it, just type in Wheel of Privilege, and you'll see on this wheel an outline of some of the categories wherein we might have privilege. So one example is formal education. Those of us who were had the opportunity to receive like a post-secondary degree or a bachelor's degree, that puts us in a really close to this center of power that gives us an element of privilege that we earned, right? That we had the opportunity to go to school, we had the support, whatever it might look like. We worked hard to get that degree. So maybe we did earn that level of privilege. Now, there are also unearned levels of privilege, things that I was just born with. So, like my skin color is an example of that. Whiteness is often centered in privilege and power. And so that unearned privilege then becomes my responsibility, my delight to build bridges for those who are further away in that center of power. So I don't know if I'm explaining this perfectly, but I think if you Google the wheel, then you'll have kind of this understanding of what I'm trying to describe around privilege, that whether it's earned or unearned, there are just certain advantages that we have in life. And that can be a beautiful thing. It's not a bad thing to have privilege. It's a bad thing if we have privilege and we do nothing with it. So I think to your question on how can male allies use this privilege, it's so many of the tactics that we've shared already, and having the courage to speak up in those spaces, to celebrate women, to amplify their voices, to set the example of what that more balanced version of gender allyship might look like at home, and then how it bleeds in our communities. I think that's probably missing some things. I know there's other ways that we could explain that might be more impactful for folks. Anything that you would add, or maybe even correct me on the way that men can use that privilege?
How can you mentioned the wheel, and I'm gonna go research that because I had a guest from South Africa, and and who acknowledge his privilege as a male and as a white male also. And you mentioned the bridge. How can one use their privilege,
Mm,
born or earned, um, to build that gap or to build a bridge, to breach or build a bridge to help those that are less privileged to at
mhm.
least get to the center?
Yeah. Yeah, I love the question. And I think it requires a lot of courage. It's not, it's a skill that we can learn, that we can improve the more that we learn to speak up. But I think as we're building bridges, the first step in that is just being aware of the opportunity that we have because of certain of those characteristics. So, when I go around that circle, I'm white, I'm educated, I'm heterosexual, I have a pretty healthy, mental health, pretty healthy physical health, middle class. So I tend to, in that circle, sit close to the center of power, or, in maybe like the second rung, right? Like I'm a woman, but I have so many other advantages in life. And so I think it comes with acknowledging that all of us have some level of power, some level of influence. We all have rooms where our voice will be heard. And so I think we have to have the courage to speak up in those spaces, and then to continue to interrogate and unlearn some of the biases that um, we might just not be aware of. So I think awareness is that first step. And then how do we build the bridges? We keep speaking up, we keep amplifying voices, we keep inviting folks who might not be represented in those rooms. Another tactic that's really small and may sound silly, but is something that's kind of helped me in my unlearning, is just counting by identity. So like if I'm sitting in a leadership meeting, looking around and seeing how many women are present, literally counting. If I'm sitting in a community workshop, how many women of color are here? Where could we, amplify some of the voices that are not represented? And again, it's a really small step, building that awareness and just acknowledging what the circles we run in look like. But I think once we do that, then it becomes a lot more apparent where we can build bridges.
Can I say something, Rachel? That's not a very small step. Coming from a woman of color and someone who has worked in an environment with a lot of white women, um, I've never heard any of them acknowledge their privilege, one,
Hmm.
and um, even articulate the power that comes with their privilege and the desire to
Hmm.
build a bridge. No. So that is not a small task.
Hmm.
And, I don't want you to minimize the impact that that has.
Hmm. Thank you for saying that. That's really beautiful.
You're welcome. I just have to acknowledge that and let you know that coming from a woman of color, that's not just a little act or a small feat. It's
Mhm.
huge. And flowers.
Thank you. To you as well.
Thank you. Um, like, could you discuss, there are these two terms, the concept of calling in versus
Mhm.
calling out, and how it relates to male allyship?
Yes. Um, I might not describe this perfectly. I have a colleague, her name is Velche Stokes. If anyone wants to look her up online, or if you want to interview her, Sharmin, she's amazing. She's the one who kind of taught me about the difference between these terms and the way that they both serve a function. So she's kind of taught me that, calling in is the term that a lot of folks are saying now, like, let's be respectful in the way that we have these conversations. Let's make sure that, we come from a place of kindness and generosity. And that's kind of the way that I try and lead, and what I really believe in male allyship. But what I love that I learned from Velche is calling out has a place too. For example, if you're in a meeting and somebody makes a blatantly sexist comment that is wildly inappropriate. Velshi is the kind of person who has the courage to say, hold on, stop. We don't do that here. And in those moments, it sends this really powerful signal to the women in the room or other underrepresented folks that they have an ally.
Mhm.
And so I think, there's this tactic from the book Good Guys, another one that I'd highly recommend. I just love reading, so I apologize for all the book recommendations, but where they say that male allies keep a word in their back pocket at all times so that they can respond within 2 seconds. So maybe you say, ouch, maybe you just ask what, but when you see a moment of discrimination that is harmful and is going to set a precedent for the culture in your corporation that is not a positive precedent, then you need to have the courage to call out and use that word, speak it within 2 seconds, say what, and then interrupt that conversation, buy you time to say what you want to say next. Ask, I'm not sure if you meant it that way, but did you know this is how it landed? And kind of educate in those spaces. Again, I'm a big believer in calling in, let's educate the people in our lives, let's share our personal stories, let them know what it means to be a woman or to have our identities and how that is played out in our circumstances. But calling out has a purpose too.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for the examples.
Mm.
And I love that you read that much and you have given us so many resources um, in the 40 minutes that we've been here. We have a lot of resources that I will add to the show notes. What is your vision for the future of male allyship?
Mm. In every room where we're celebrating International Women's History Day, for example, I want it to be half men, half women. In every policy meeting where we're talking about getting period products in women's bathrooms, where we're talking about childcare stipends, where we're talking about, Me Too, whatever it is, let's have just as many men who are engaged in the work as we have women. And I believe as we see those coalitions of men and women who are equally agitated about gender equity and who are equally committed to seeing change in those spaces, that's where the impact is going to come from. So my vision is always, let's see a healthy balance of men and women working together for gender equality.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I think my last question, can you share a moment or a time when you had to unlearn a behavior, a belief, um, just to be a better ally?
Yes, let me think about that one. I think that example of counting by identity is something that I've had to do in my own circles. Utah, as well as being, a little behind in gender equity, has some other areas that we can improve. And I remember, you know, a few months ago, I was at a big community meeting where I literally timed the speakers. And in the 2 hour meeting, there were 12 minutes of women speaking, and the rest of the 2 hours was spoken by men. I then looked around the room and counted by identity, and in a room of about 100, I saw 2 women of color. And it was a really powerful moment for me to notice that this is where I'm spending my time. And this is where I'm investing my energy and my resources and my money sometimes. And I think if we can be more conscious
Mm.
of the way of the places that we're spending time in, it really quickly helps us to realize where we have work to do. So again, I had that experience. I picked up those books that I recommended, and I've just tried to be more thoughtful about, sure, this is might be the demographic of my state, but there are rooms where those proportions look different. And I need to do better to enter those rooms and to seek them out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Um, thank you. Whew. This was really good. I really enjoy this, and thank you for being authentic. Thank you for sharing your truth. Um, And in closing, would you like to share anything, leave anything with us?
I want to say thank you to you, Sherman, for your incredible generosity. I know that there are things that I probably got wrong on this call today, and I'm really committed to continuing to unlearn and continuing to unpack ways that I can be a better ally in my own space. And so I'm grateful for people like you who hold the opportunity to have these really challenging conversations. Anytime we're talking about something like gender equity, inclusion, allyship, we're gonna get some things wrong. But I think it's still our duty and our delight to keep trying.
I agree. And even if we get it wrong, there's room for to correct it. And we're not perfect. We're humans, and to err is human. So um,
Yeah.
it's okay to, if you didn't get any, if something wasn't right according to whose standards and whose definition. Uh,
Mhm.
I think you did an excellent job. I think that you caused me to rethink a statement I made in an earlier podcast, that I have never heard an American acknowledge and acknowledge their privilege and the power that comes behind the privilege. And here you are. I can't make that statement again. I'll always say Rachel Cottam is the very first white woman who has acknowledged her privilege, and the first white American. The first time I heard a white woman acknowledging her privilege was during the 16 days of activism last year. And I interrupted her, sorry, to say, what did you say?
Mm.
I said, I need to commend you for that and give you the biggest bouquet of flowers because I've never heard this.
Mm.
And here you are, refuting my statement. And I enjoyed talking to you. I enjoyed connecting with your authentic self. You're so authentic. Continue to be that way. Continue to promote male allyship. And I will be calling on you again because I would like you to be here again because you have so much to offer us.
Thank you, Sharman. I am so glad that you dropped in my inbox. I feel like I've made a friend for life.
Yes, you did. And how can our listeners contact you if they choose to?
Please look me up on LinkedIn. I post pretty frequently on there about these topics. And you can always find me on my website too, rachelcottam.com. And that's where you can download that playbook free. I would love feedback. I'm always interested in how we can improve and what other tactics we can share. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. This was another episode of Anything Gender Podcast. I am your host, Sharmin Prince, and thank you to our guest, Rachel Cottam, and we'll see you next time.